Hello, and welcome to Proteges, where we address real-life topics from a godly perspective. I am your host, Travis Johnson. Today, I will be addressing the importance of knowing and defending our constitutional rights. But before I dig into this topic of discussion, please like and subscribe to my channel. You don't want to miss out on more content going forward. Let's get started. There was a time in my life when I cared nothing about the Constitution because I didn't know what the Constitution was. I heard the word Constitution thrown around. I didn't care about it at all. As I matured and was adopted, I started to see the importance of and knowing the Constitution. Our U.S. Constitution. Growing up in the hood, there was no one teaching us about our constitutional rights. It was most certainly not taught in my school, and I bet in most, if not all, Memphis City schools. Well, at least not in my generation. It is so important for us as U.S. citizens to know and defend our constitutional rights. Let me read from something that Chief Justice John Jay said. Every member of the state ought diligently to read and to study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. Chief Justice John Jay. This reminds me of Apostle Paul in Acts 22, where Paul was being persecuted for the faith. He knew he would be persecuted for Jesus Christ if he went to Jerusalem and was even willing to die. He was told not to go, but went anyway. So, when Paul arrived at Jerusalem, and later, after being told to observe the law, he went to the temple and purified himself and gave notice of the completion of days until the sacrifice was offered him. He was then arrested and beaten. He nearly died. Let me read from Acts 22, starting in verse 22 through 29. Up to this word, they listened to him. Then they raised their voices and said, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the tribune ordered him to be brought into the barracks, saying that he should be examined by flogging, to find out why they were shouting against him like this. But when they had stretched him out for the whips, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and uncondemned?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman citizen." So the tribune came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "I bought this citizenship for a large sum." Paul said, "But I am a citizen by birth." So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately, and the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Now, if you read further ahead in chapter 23, you will see how the Lord protected Paul using his nephew to get Paul away from about 40 men who laid in ambush ready to kill Paul. Paul's nephew spoke to the tribune and Paul survived. Paul used the fact that he was a Roman citizen, and according to his citizenship, Paul was heard and his case was considered, and he was provided a way of escape. By God, through the tribune, he knew not only God's law and loved it, he also knew his rights as a Roman citizen. Now, considering what John Jay said concerning reading and knowing the Constitution, in order to defend and assert it, we ought to see why it is important for us to know the importance of the law. You heard it right. The Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, is the law. The U.S. Constitution is the nation's fundamental law. It codifies the core values of the American people. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the United States. It defines the fundamental law of the U.S. federal government, setting forth our three branches of federal government, namely the legislative, executive, and judicial government. The Constitution outlines their jurisdictions. It has become the foundational legal document of the Western world. The Constitution was written in 1787, ratified in 1788, and has been in operation since 1789. The U.S. Constitution is the world's largest surviving written charter of government, which means it is very effective. Its first three words, "we the people," affirm that the government of the United States exists to serve its citizens. We should see it and hear it like this: we the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. Why? Because we select our leaders. They come from our nation, and they are for us. So, the statement, America first, is truth. Abraham Lincoln said it this way, speaking of those who gave their last breath for our freedom: "It is from these honored dead that we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their full measure of devotion, that we highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth." Now, I want to say something. Remember, the U.S. Constitution is a law. And because it is, whenever it is broken by our government, both locally and nationwide, they should be arrested immediately. Sadly, many of us citizens don't know that breaking the Constitution shall lead to arrests and prison time. Our leaders are constantly breaking the Constitution, and they are getting away with it. It is literally a crime shame, as my mother used to say. With that being said, I want to spend some time breaking down Chief Justice John Jay's quote. I will quote it again. "Every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better to defend and assert them." Let's start with the first 5 words. Every member of the state. This means every single citizen of the United States of America. This includes those who became citizens of America from another country. And guess what? They at least know the foundations of the Constitution, and they know it upon obtaining citizenship. And if those from another country who legally became citizens of our nation know the foundation of the United States Constitution, how much more those of us who are born here? There is no excuse for us not to know our own nation's document that was written for us to know and digest. Next, ought diligently, John Jay said, ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country. Can you imagine where we would be as a country if our citizens truly read and studied the Constitution of this country? What if in our schools and home schools, each child was taught the U.S. Constitution. Think of where things in our country would be. Now let me define diligently. Diligently means to carry a task through with care and conscientiousness. So, this means we are to carefully and thoroughly read the Constitution. After we carefully read it with great sincerity, we are to study it. Studying requires slowing down and digging into the foundations of the Constitution, which means also knowing the Declaration of Independence. Studying the Declaration of Independence will help you know and understand the Constitution all the more. Again, the U.S. Constitution is this nation's fundamental law. It codifies the core values of the American people. Thirdly, John Jay quotes, "Teach the rising generation to be free." Now, if you have read and studied the Constitution, the next thing you can do is teach it. Again, teaching it to the next generation is a must. The truth is if people read and studied the Constitution, they would want to talk about it and teach it. You would not be able to keep it to yourself, especially with regard to where our country is presently. We are not in a good place. The next generation is not in a good place with regard to the future. They should be invested in and taught the U.S. Constitution. Their rights will be and are being attacked. There is no doubt about that. They should be given a chance to defend themselves by given the knowledge of their rights as U.S. citizens. They should be both spiritually and nationally secured. Paul was spiritually secure, and he had the knowledge of his rights as a Roman citizen. So should our children, more importantly, have a biblical knowledge, and then they should have their constitutional knowledge. Let us not forget about the word free in Chief John Justice quote. Why free? Free has to do with our freedoms or being free from a tyrannical government. Remember, those that signed the Declaration of Independence 10 years before the U.S. Constitution was written did it for freedom. Our founding fathers signed the document at the risk of their lives. And indeed, some died at the very hands of the one they were seeking to escape from. His name was King George III. The Constitution simply manifests our freedoms. Next, John Jay said, by knowing their rights. You should want to protect your rights. Well, the only way to protect your rights is to know them. And the U.S. Constitution was written and preserved so that all Americans can always read and know their rights. Why? Why would you want to neglect knowing your rights? Like the First Amendment, written in 1791. Listen to this. It prohibits the Congress from obstructing the exercise of certain individual freedoms, like freedom of religion, or freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition. Or the Second Amendment, which is a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed upon. In other words, your guns cannot be taken from you. Know your rights, or better, your freedoms. Fifth, John Jay says, they will sooner perceive when they are violated. It is imperative that we ensure that the next generation can perceive when their rights are being violated or if they are being infringed upon. Know this, their rights will be violated by the government. It is inevitable. There is no reason for the next generation to be in the dark about their constitutional rights. The only reason they would be in the dark is because we as parents are not and do not take our constitutional rights seriously. It is our responsibility as parents and leaders to teach our children their constitutional rights. We need to be urgent about taking our children's spiritual life seriously. Likewise, we need to thank God for our Constitution and take our citizenship serious. Like Apostle Paul, it has to be important that we know our advantages as citizens of our country. And then John Jay said, "Be the better to defend and assert them." Lastly, how can we defend what we have not read, studied, taught, know, and perceived as being violated? We don't want to be ignorant of that which has been endowed to us by God Himself. Our human rights on this earth is a gracious gift by our Lord God Himself. Don't take your rights for granted. If we continue to neglect our constitutional rights, we should not be shocked when they are completely taken away. Then it will be too late to fight for them. As our forefathers were signing the Declaration of Independence and writing the Constitution, they knew that one day the government would seek to violate and take them away. So they wrote them down and had them preserved for us. They wanted us to have record of our freedoms so that we would fight to keep them secure. I want to show you this 3-minute clip of Rick Green talking about our responsibility of reading and studying the Constitution. This was very encouraging and was one of the reasons I began to take my responsibility of knowing the Constitution very serious. Take a look.
In fact, I'm going to make a statement to you that you may think is a little bit overblown. How many of you understand that the fate of America depends upon her constitutional principles being upheld and preserved and protected? And how many would agree that the fate of her constitutional principles being upheld and preserved and protected depends upon the first 3 words of the Constitution, which is what? We the people. So if the fate of the free world depends on America, if America depends upon our constitutional principles, if our constitutional principles depend upon we the people, then friends, the fate of the free world depends on you. And so we're here to challenge ourselves, to dig deep into these documents to say, okay, what's my job? What do I go do as a citizen to preserve freedom? And I tell you, I'm seeing more of this than I've ever seen in my life. I mean, I've been doing this for 15 years, but I've never seen the level of activity in our nation. I've never seen so many people coming out to say, hey, I want to learn about the Founding Fathers. I want to know what freedom's all about. I want to know what the Constitution said. How many of you seen all these bumper stickers? How many driven by a car seen a bumper sticker that said, read the Constitution? Anybody seen one of those? Okay, a guy like me, I see that bumper sticker, I'm honking. Okay, I'm sorry. I get excited when I see that. But we've all said that for years. Read the Constitution. Everybody needs to read the Constitution. But we don't usually do it. Most people never actually pick it up. I didn't. I went through law school and was a legislator. I didn't read through the Constitution back then. In fact, I'll tell you what really got me fired up about actually studying the founding documents. I was sitting in my Capitol office back in Austin, Texas, back when I was a legislator. And I'm sitting in my office and I'm reading this poll, and the poll says, it was a Texas poll, so if you're not from Texas, you don't have to feel bad about this poll, but I'm betting your numbers in your state weren't any better. Here's what the poll said. The poll said that half of Texans, half, could not name one freedom out of the First Amendment. Not even one. There's 5 there that we love, we hold dear, we cherish, we'd fight for, we'd die for. Half of Texans couldn't even name one of them. 95% could not name 2 of the 5. I was appalled. Then I tried to name them. Then it was me. I couldn't name them. And I thought, wow, I'm a legislator. I'm a lawyer. I'm a political junkie, man. I live, breathe, and eat this stuff. I'm doing it all. And I couldn't name them. I thought, what a shame. If I don't know what my freedoms are, if I don't know where they are, how am I going to defend it? How am I going to teach my kids these things if I don't know myself? That every kid in Texas has to spend time studying these guys. Studying the Declaration and the Constitution, studying the men that gave them, studying the ideas that went behind them, and studying our military and studying the sacrifices made. And we're not going to just gloss over it once in 5th or 11th grade and forget about it. We're going to teach it every single year so that we can pound it into the minds of our young people, so we can put it in their hearts and their souls so that they'll appreciate the freedom they've been given, and they'll be able to defend and protect it for future generations.
I am doing my part. Join me in doing your part. Learn the Constitution and teach it to your children, and exhort them to teach it to their children. Now, this earth is not our home, but we are to be grateful and steward what the Lord has blessed us with to the glory of God. So, I want to read this quote by Chief Justice John Jay again. Every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country, and teach the rising generation to be free. By knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when they are violated and be the better to defend and assert them. So, there are 6 things you need to do. Read the Constitution. Study the Constitution. Teach the Constitution to your children. Know the Constitution, defend the Constitution, and assert your constitutional rights. Now, if this episode was helpful to you, please like, subscribe, and share my channel with your friends and family. And until next time, go and be protégés while in this world. Grace and peace.